Good afternoon, everyone. Today is November the 30th, 2021. It's a little bit after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We're here for the Maryland Public Service Commission PC54 Community Choice Pilot. My name is Jennifer Grace. I'm going to quickly go through the names that are on the call today, although there's a couple notations of like phone numbers people are calling in on that doesn't list names. We have Abner Sadick, Adam Fairbanks, Adriana Hochberg, Al Bartlett, Beverly Sikora, Bill Fields, Bob Reaping, Dee Woomer, Dan Tudor, Daria Pugh, David Bloom, David Farmer, David Hoppick, Elizabeth Stroud, Gary Skolnick, Jason Mathias, Jeffrey Trout, Jorge Aguilar, Katie Lanzarato, Kenneth Albert, Lori McGilvray, Leah Gibbons, Lily Hawkins, Lisa Brennan, Maria Locastro, Mark Fanning, Melanie Grant, Misty Rininger, Peter Wilson, Phil Vanderhayden, Robbie Atkins, Robert Brown, Robert Loeb, Stan Edwards, Susan Miller, Taylor Beckham, Tiffany Cowan, Valerie Mayoni. If I did not call your name, please type your name in the chat so I can list you on the minutes for today. We have a slide presentation from staff, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to staff.
Good afternoon, Judge Grace. This is Phil Vanderhayden from staff. I think Dave Hoppick has our presentation, so does he have the ability to present that?
He should now.
Dave's got two things he'll need to put up. We have a PowerPoint that we're going to go through, then we have a spreadsheet. So when we get to the spreadsheet's not embedded in the PowerPoint, but we'll get to that probably a couple slides down, and I'll ask Dave to put that up. So essentially just proceed through this. Obviously, if folks have questions as you go, feel free to jump in and ask those, because we do want to, in this initial meeting, try to get everybody on the same page about, make sure everybody understands what we're trying to do with these first three meetings, based on the topics that we introduced at the last meeting, and why it's an issue. We think there probably are a lot of different options that we have not introduced here, and we're definitely looking for feedback, from the various stakeholders as we go through this, and then also between meetings, when we may add some additional things for discussion for the next time. So, Dave, you can move to the second slide. So what we're going to focus on today is the transition from SOS to the CCA, which is as yet a little bit uncertain in terms of the exact timeline, which is also part of what we're going to talk about, but we expect would be occurring sometime after the end of 23, so in the spring, summer, fall of 2024. But it bumps up against the SOS schedule for bids that will impact that same time frame. So that's why we're going through this. I think we talked about that a lot the last couple of meetings, but just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. All right, so I think in this first couple of slides here, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page about why this is important and how this could have an impact on SOS in particular, and then why it's necessary to try and manage the risk to the SOS wholesale bidders so it doesn't impact their prices, that sort of thing. Just generally, and I'll just briefly go over this because I think we talked about it before, we expect once the CCA becomes operational, there will be the opportunity for somewhere in the order of over 200,000 customers in Montgomery County, possibly, to be switching either at once or over some period of time, or phased in over a couple of years. So we think that represents a potential issue for the SOS wholesale bid process, and we want to make sure that we've done everything we can on the front end this far in advance of when this could occur to make sure we don't have any negative outcomes there. And we'll go over the dates in a second, but on the understanding is that the next bid cycle, and SOS's bid for residential customers in particular, in October and in April of each year, contracts that would start either 4 or 8 months later, roughly. The next bid cycle is April of 2022. We've already completed the October bid cycle. Those contracts will start in October of 22, but they're 2-year contracts, and so they will go all the way through to the end of September of 24. Contracts that were just bid will end in the end of May of 24. So we don't really have anything. If there's an impact to those contracts or from the CCA starting up, if it starts up, say, prior to the end of those contracts, I don't think there's much we can do at this point. Those contracts are set, although there may be some options. But what we're trying to do is address the next set of bids. There will be the months from June through September of 24 that could involve a lot of switching for the CCA, and that's what we're going to sort of speak about. Dave, let's go to the next slide. So I'll ask Dave maybe to explain a little bit of where these numbers are coming in. But this slide is just sort of starting off our discussion with an idea of how early we would actually have to worry about this. So our folks have gone through this and tried to sort this out as what is the actual earliest that something of this nature could occur. I think we want to talk about that and make sure everybody's on the same page about this. But I think what we're going to talk about in the rest of this presentation is two options that would actually not start at the earliest date possible, but start either in June or in October of 24, such that they coincide with the end of the contract. Those are just two options, but I think we're just focusing on them because we need to move on this quickly, and we're trying to sort of reflect on this probably at a high level in a simple way. But again, we're not trying to take any positions here that would kind of change the ability of the CCA to start at different dates. So let me just ask David, can you just go over with everyone how we arrived at the issue of, or the date as to when the CCA could start earliest? If you could just go through the details on that, and then let's take a break and see if folks have any questions about how we reached that, and maybe Montgomery County, as we're going through this, you could think of if you have anything you would like to say about, whether or not you have an opinion as to when you would want to, when the county would want to actually begin the CCA. This might be something helpful for the conversation going forward. So Dave, why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
Okay. So the legislation specifically states that community choice aggregation, the county may form community choice aggregation after December 31st, 2023. And if you look to the right, you'll see the reference that's 7-510 period 3, section C. We, reading through the legislation, we think that's the earliest possible date for approval of a community choice aggregation plan by the commission would be approximately December 31st, 2023. Just looking at this from the perspective of what is the absolute earliest this could begin based on the language in the legislation. And so, there are requirements to at least 60 days before initiating a process to provide notice. And then after that, there's a second notice 60 days after that. And the way we were reading the legislation, again, purely from the angle of what is the absolute earliest this could start, that both of those notice processes could happen before December 31st, 2023, and happen with enough time before, such that in theory, the commission could give an approval to form community choice aggregation on December 31st, 2023. And then after that, there is the requirement to provide notice to customers, that 30-day window. And so, the 30-day window plus some time for mailing, plus some time for folks to mail things back. We, based on that, arrive at the earliest date for enrollment, which is synonymous with the CCA potentially serving load, would be mid-February 24, thereabouts. We do note that realistically, we think that the county would want to know what the regs actually say, and there is a requirement to finalize the regs by December 31st, 2023. So we have what we're calling a earliest realistic start date of approximately mid-June. So, assuming that the clock started about December 31st, 2023, you would get that 60-day notice under Section D, the 60-day notice before initiating a process to form a community choice aggregator. And then after that, under Section E, there's the filing with the commission. And we're assuming at minimum approximately 60 days after that filing before the commission renders a decision. And then we have the additional time for the 30-day notice and some buffer time around that 30-day notice for mailing and receiving back notices. And that's how we arrive at around mid-June 2024. So I'd like to pause there for questions. As Phil mentioned, we do have another visual, but I was going to pause there before I brought up the visual. Okay.
Look, David, I had one question that really was related to the earlier slide that Phil was talking about. I just want to ask this. You may cover it later, although I didn't see it when I previewed the slides. It would help us to understand also with respect to the SOS process. We talk about April and October. What's the latest point at which conditions could change before the April bid, for example? In other words, do you need to know how many customers might be going into the CCA by the end of March or beginning of March or February? What sort of lead time is there in preparation for the bid? I guess that would be helpful for us to know. And you don't need to answer that now, but that would be something we would like more information on.
Dan,
Yeah,
you're asking about, sorry, Dave. Dan, you're asking about how soon, say in the next couple of months or weeks, we need to let the commission know we need to change SOS?
Well, yeah, I guess that's part of it. I just, when we talk about April and October, I know the bidding occurs in April and October, but I assume there's some preparation for that. And I just don't know whether that preparation requires a few days to be prepared or a few weeks, and what sort of system changes or whatever kind of things might influence the bids that need to be known by the bidders, and what's the lead time for that?
Okay. I think, and I'm going to let Dave go into his Excel sheet, which is maybe going to show a little bit more about how these bids are layered on top of each other when they start and end.
Okay.
But I think based on our discussion from the last call, I think we had this SOS to CCA. We're going to talk about this in 3 meetings. I think our expectation is that very early in January, so we have a 3rd meeting scheduled for the 4th, we will need to know if we're going to the SOS process to account for load shifting during 2024. And I think we still need to understand how long it will take to get that change implemented, if we're going to make a change. It's quite possible we would not also have to do that, but we probably need to know, in the middle of January, and then make a filing with the commission, because the SOS bid process is governed by an entirely different proceeding. And I think we need to explore if a change can be made to the bid process, how we use that proceeding to effectuate that. So that's probably applying to the commission, to petition a change, and probably reaching out to the various stakeholders in that case. And then, there's probably some discussions that would have to be done between the utility folks to prepare for the bids, to understand how long it would take to make that happen. But I think if the bid's going to be probably like 30th of April, we would need to know, more than a month before that, maybe 2 months before that, if we're going to propose any changes to the way the bids will be conducted, the size of the bids, the length, the changes to the contract length, anything of that nature that we've sort of addressed that has to be fixed or altered for this. So we have a very near term. We need to know this, very early in January. We have to have a good sense of where we're going to go. And then I think we have some more things to nail down to figure out how long it will take.
Okay, so there's
I followed up with the commission, and we need to make a filing on this. We need to make a decision in December so that we can have a filing within the first 2 weeks of January, this January 2022.
You're saying you need a decision in December about whether some customers from Montgomery County will be joining the CCA in a way that would affect the April 2022 bid?
The bids at the next SOS proceeding will be affected by the timeline in front of you.
Yeah.
And in order to make changes, if we need to make changes to that process, it's a separate proceeding, not under the umbrella of this PC work group. That needs to go before the commission. It needs to be initiated before the commission in the first 2 weeks of January 2022, this January, so that they can finish that prior to the next SOS bid.
Okay, and the number of customers that might be part of that bid from Montgomery County is a material thing that would have to be approved by the commission?
I don't think we're going to know the number of customers that are going to be affected. What we're talking about is knowing when, having an estimate of the number of customers and when that load will shift.
Yeah.
So it's more the timeline that we need to know of when Montgomery County is looking to start.
Right. And I'm just trying to understand what that timeline is. In other words, if we say, yes, we're interested in starting the CCA program such that, and we're talking about whether this is all at once or in stages, that's the purpose of today's discussion, or at least the subject of today's discussion. Suppose we said, yeah, we'd like a quarter of the customers to switch, and we think that will affect the April 21 bids. I'm just trying to understand that, just saying the number of customers, that is something that's material enough that it has to get commission approval.
I could maybe just try to respond to that, Judge Grace. I think, Stan, what we're concerned about is if the number of customers that switch would have an impact on the way the wholesale bidders would price the SOS that they're going to bid in April.
Yeah.
And if we have an understanding that there's a likely, they're all going to switch at once, or if it's going to somehow be parsed out in much smaller scale, we may be able to reach an understanding, or at least to have almost a guess, really, as to whether or not that would be a significant number of accounts to impact the way the wholesale bidders would be pricing. So I think we're trying to, if you're maybe telling us that we're thinking of starting this very slowly and small, but during the time frame when these contracts would be affected, then it's not maybe it's clear cut. If you were saying, look, we actually think we would want to start this in October, then the next set of bids might not be affected at all.
Yeah.
And then we have a little more time to deal with it. But if
Right.
you plan to start in significant numbers anytime around or after June 1, it would impact the next set of bids.
Yeah.
That size of that impact to be significant. That's where we have to figure out if we need to make some changes that would allow the bid to be unaffected by any uncertainty, caused by the switching that will occur 2 years out.
Right. No, I understand that Montgomery County's the leaving of some customers to the CCA would affect the bids. What I'm trying to understand is the timeline in which that decision needs to be made. And what I heard Judge Grace say was we needed to make a decision by December so there can be a filing. And all I'm trying to understand is simply changing the number of customers that might be bid in the April 2022 auction. Is that something that requires the Public Service Commission to say, yes, this is okay? Or, because it seems to me the process stays the same. It's just the number of the load that the suppliers are bidding on is different. And I'm just trying to understand, is that something that's material enough that has to go through the commission approval process? Or if the bidders know by mid-March that when the bids come up in April, it's going to be a different load than historically has been there. Is that, in other words, that gives us more time to figure out what we need to do? Because there's other steps that the county needs to take related to this that aren't mentioned in the PowerPoint here. For example, we have to adopt a local law. And just like the commission has timelines and processes, we have timelines and processes. And so we've got to factor that into our timing. And because the regulations may go until the end of 23, and we've got to get this local law adopted in there, and that local law has got to talk about our aggregation plan. Our council has to approve that local law. They're going to want to know what the aggregation plan looks like. And so that complicates the timeline. So I'm just trying to get a better understanding of when that decision needs to be made as far as affecting. I understand that our load, taking some of our load, would affect SOS pricing. I'm just trying to understand the timing of that, when that needs to be known.
This is,
I think maybe there's two elements there. The number of accounts that would be affected and when those accounts would be affected. I think we are perhaps are coming at this with the assumption that any change to the SOS process, which I think dictates the number of blocks of load and the size of those blocks, and the terms under which it was provided by the bidders. It's determined that we have to change that because of the expected number of accounts. Then we need to act, as Judge Grace said, to get something to the commission in early January. If through our discussions, folks can come to some sort of agreement that what the change being proposed wouldn't actually require a change in the process at all, which could be either a very small amount that possibly fits within the existing parameters for increases or decreases in load due to normal retail choice switching, or if the start date falls outside of when this the next contracts are impacted, and we may be able to come to an agreement that we don't need to make changes. What we're trying to discuss. If we have to make a change, I think we're assuming we have to do that with enough time to change the April bids, which sounds like it's January.
but this is Bill Fields with OPC. I mean, Stan, I think what we're hearing is, I mean, if the bidding process is going to change, that has to go through a separate proceeding with the commission, with different set of stakeholders and that sort of thing to make that decision. And it sounds like the commission wants to get that process started in January. In that other case, if there's a possibility that that something should change about the April procurement.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just not being as familiar with the bidding process as others on the call. I was just trying to understand what constituted a material change in that process. And so it sounds like from what Phil said, the number of blocks that have to be purchased, the number of customers, that is a significant enough change that this process that Judge Grace talked about would have to be followed. So that helps.
Hey, Phil and David, this is Bob Reaping from Potomac Edison. Just wanted to make one point. We keep talking about June and October. That is only applicable to BG&E and the PHI companies. Potomac Edison has residential load that it bids out 4 times a year: October, January, April, and June. So fortunately, the first contract beyond June 1 of 2024 is in the April timeframe. But I just wanted to make the whole group aware it's not just 2 times a year for everybody in Maryland.
Thanks, Bob. That's definitely a good point. I think we were focusing on the Pepco load first, but make sure so Dave, why don't you go ahead, unless there's any further questions, Dave, why don't you go ahead and sort of let's get everybody out, make sure everyone understands how the bids layer on top of each other when they start and end, and which of the bids.
Phil, before you move on, can I just ask one question about that slide?
Yep.
The first bullet on the left says county may submit 60-day notice and CCA plan prior to December 31, 2021. Do you mean 2023?
Yes. Good catch, Lisa.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I thought so, but changed the conversation drastically if I misunderstood. Thank
That's
you.
good. We would have had to get busy.
I know, really.
Okay. So this is something that hopefully illustrates on a month-by-month basis around our transition at the beginning of 24 through 24, how that kind of overlays with the Exelon. So Pepco has the same bid schedule as BGE, and I basically, please focus on BGE and, make that synonymous with Pepco. And then I also did include PE below here as well. So, we already had a October 2021 bid. So for the Exelon utilities, that bid covers load through the end of September. So that's, the red X's here. And October is blue. So that's the blue X's, and that covers through the end of May. And so there would be an ending, a rolling off of these contracts effective June 1st. The bid that will be conducted by the Exelon utilities in April of next year, so BGE meaning Pepco and BGE, will cover load through the end of September 2024. So October 1st, 2024 would be when those contracts would roll off. So, the earlier conversation about transitions that coincide with the ending of contracts, that's where we come to June 2024 and October 2024. As Bob mentioned with Potomac Edison, and hopefully I have this correct, their bid schedule is a little different. They do bids more often, and then those bids are for periods that end in May. So we have a series of bids that end in May 2024 including the recent October bid. And then it looks like the next bid that Potomac Edison will do that will affect beyond May 2024 is this upcoming April 2022 bid. And so that contract would include load through 2024. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that was somewhat helpful. And we can share this, we can send this to Judge Grace to share with the group.
So David, thanks. This is helpful. If I understand correctly, both the Exelon Utilities and PE would be affected in April 22. That both of them will bid then, and those bids will go into the potentially into an expected start of the CCE. And then PE won't have a bid until many months later than the Exelon Utilities.
No, so I would agree with the first part of that statement. So the April bid will go through load in September 2024 for the Exelon Utilities. The April bid for Potomac Edison will include a contract beginning June 2024, and it goes for I believe that's a 12-month period. So this should go out, until May 2025. So if there was a decision to do a transition in June, it would affect both, depending on the size of the transition, both the Exelon bid and the PE bid.
And then, if I'm understanding the PE schedule right, they do another bid then in June 22 and one in October. So they've got in essence, they've got a bid between the Exelon Utilities that would also be affected.
Yes, so there is a bid in June 2022. Bob, is that the same time frame? Do you know offhand as the April bid, April 2022 bid?
Yeah, David, that's correct. It's the same time frame.
So it would bid out for June 24 on.
It would bid out for June 24 on through May of 25.
Okay. Thank you. It may be helpful, David, to add that column just so we know that there's another. In other words, there's a bid process that row. I'm sorry, between the the April and October Exelon bids, because that might also factor into a switchover. Although
I can work on adding that.
Great, thank you.
All right. Dan, does that sort of, and then if anyone else who has any questions about this, because sometimes the visualizing the time for these, I know it always gives me trouble trying to remember what starts when. But I guess what I'm drawing from this is if you look at the column A, E there in June 24, if the CCA starts up after that, it's not affecting the bid that we just held in October. And then a contract, if the CCA were to start up in October of 24 or after, it wouldn't impact the load from the April bid. So we're just trying to sort of address, from Dave's calculation, if loads began switching as early as February 24, you would affect all of those contracts. The longer.
So
Go ahead, Dave.
I would add one caveat. If we started in October 24, a transition, it looks like the upcoming April bid would not affect the Exelon Utilities, but it would affect Potomac Edison.
That's
Bob,
right.
would you agree with that?
That is correct.
I'm not sure if we've done any sort of analysis on the number of customers within Montgomery County for BG&E and for Potomac Edison. I think was it like 10,000 in BG&E and 32,000 in or some 30,000 something in PE. So there may be something that affects the number of eligible accounts that can be affected. Might be something to look at as well there.
Do you mean overall, or do you mean SOS customers?
SOS is, I guess what I'm thinking of there is quite possibly number of Montgomery County eligible customers in the BG&E service territory might be small enough that it doesn't impact the current increment decrement function that sort of accounts for putting that comes over, for regular retail choice. I certainly haven't done that calculation. I think we have the full expectation that Pepco's service territory is affected because of the amount, and then I don't know if the number of eligible accounts within Potomac Edison's territory in Montgomery County is large enough that if it switched all at once, it would impact. But maybe 30,000 out of some thousand residential accounts, if I have that number right, that may be big enough anyway. But
So Phil, this is Lori. Along those lines, I'd appreciate some analysis, because you were headed right where I was formulating a question. Sort of what's the tipping point where it's going to affect the bids, or, have an effect to the planning that needs to happen. And so it's both a question of what percentage of customers in the bid, whether depending on the utility, are in Montgomery County, and are they sufficient enough to make a difference in the bid, setting aside Pepco. And then secondly, if the CCA starts, say, a month ahead of June or 6 weeks, that is only a portion of the period of time that the bid covers. So it's both the number of customers overall, what percentage of Montgomery County customers are captured within the bid, and then if you take customers out, but not at the beginning of the bid period, but towards the end of it, does that too be sufficiently small that it would not affect the bid if it's by a matter of, say, weeks, rather than having these clean deadlines?
We would probably have to take that back and try to analyze sort of the volumetric impacts for each territory as well. I think we were not attempting to do that at this first cut. I would certainly, if anyone on the call cares to hazard a guess, or has some understanding of whether or not the proportions that could be impacted different service territories, or hazard a guess or an opinion about whether or not impacting the tail end of the last few months of the contract has what sort of impact that would have on the on someone who would have to sort of formulate a price at which to bid for that load. I think we were not attempting to get that detailed yet, but I mean that's certainly something that might impact the analysis.
Well, it does seem relevant if kind of the decision before us, or the one that you're teeing up, is whether or not a change needs to be made to this next bid, which is a pretty big decision. So it would be useful to know kind of a sensitivity analysis. At what point does that get triggered, both in terms of size of customer base per utility, or amount of time covered?
This is Bev Sikora. I guess we can pretty much guarantee that Pepco, it is going to be significant. It's going to impact. At that point, I'm not sure I understand why it matters for the other utilities. If we're going to make this change for Pepco, it's going to, we're going to be making it for everybody. So, it's the least common denominator, but at that point, they're the worst case scenarios. That's what we have to plan for. And also, I don't know that utilities can actually say what the tipping point is. That is, I think, a question that we'd have to ask the wholesale suppliers if they'd be willing to even say. We don't understand how they're bidding, what they're doing behind the scenes. I would not want to hazard a guess for them.
This is Jeff Trout. I very much agree with what Bev just said, and let me add that my understanding from 20 years of involvement in the SOS bidding process is that what worries wholesale suppliers and what they constantly ask about is uncertainty. They need to know what the rules are before they price their offers. That's what's critical.
Right, but just to follow up on what Lori said, if the percentage of customers leaving was 3% of the total or 5% of the total, depending upon when you time that, of the total volume of supply, wouldn't that fall within the, I guess it would be the decrement procedure?
This is Bill Fields. I think it will be useful to look at the percentage of SOS that might leave, in each of these service territories, because I think what's part of what Stan just said is right. If you're talking about a small percentage of the load leaving, then maybe theoretically it could have an impact on, and I should say a small percentage of the load leaving, and maybe it only leaves at the, for a few months at the end, while that may give these wholesale suppliers some uncertainty when they're bidding. That may be, it may be decided that, that's a small amount of uncertainty that's not going to have a material effect on the price. Maybe. Now, but I think somebody earlier, I agree with what somebody earlier said, that I don't think it's a matter of whether or not it triggers the decrement provision. The decrement provision just resets an amount, a load level for a future increment. It doesn't change the fact that, the supplier has signed up for anticipating serving some number of megawatts worth of load. And then, somewhere down the line, that amount gets shifted down. They're responsible, they don't get any compensation for that. They have to serve the load that's left at the same price that they bid in the first place. So now, like I said, maybe if it's a small amount of change, it doesn't, it's not a material difference. I don't know. But whether or not it triggers that decrement, I don't think really answers the question for us.
I also have
and Bill, it's spot briefing. It's probably a little bit more than that. They're going to be looking at their pocketbooks too. So let's say they hedged the old, I'll make up numbers, at $20 and the wholesale market's 50, and we take load away. Well, they can make some money on that.
Well, yeah, they're happy about that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just numbers. You got to look at the total picture. I know you know that. I was just throwing that out for the group.
Right, but we won't know. When they're bidding, nobody's going to know. Where the market might be 2 years later when the customers leave.
And that's exactly right, which is why you got the chance that you get hit on both ends, in that they're going to apply because you don't know. You exactly hit the nail on the head. They aren't going to know, so there's most likely going to be a risk premium for any uncertainty associated with it.
And I just want to add one more thing. This is Dan Tudor from PHI. The key data point we don't know is when the suppliers are defaulted to the CCA, how many will choose to stay with SOS. So no matter if we get the date, set on when the CCA starts, the suppliers are not going to know out of 200,000 customers how many are going to stay with SOS until it actually happens during the power flow of the contract. So that's hard to estimate.
Right,
Yeah,
but that's going to be the case at any time.
That's right.
Yeah, but I'd say it's even, at the beginning, during the contract, you would expect there not to generally be large fluctuations. You could have, and I don't know if Montgomery County is going to somehow require customers to stay on their CCA for any specific period of time, or if they're going to be free to come and go as they please. If it's the free to come and go as they please, similar to choice, we haven't seen, massive changes from month to month. But I think at the beginning, it's really okay, if at a certain point you put out that, okay, all these Montgomery County customers are eligible to go or will go to CCA unless you choose to stay with BGE. It's really not until we know that, okay, of those, 50%, 75, whatever the thing is, how many of those are actually going to go to CCA? So it's kind of having to have that set far enough in ahead of when the suppliers have to, start making decisions about what they're going to price.
Beverly, can I ask you about something you said earlier about that PEPCO is sort of driving the situation here because they're the largest load? It seems to me, in talking about staging, one way to stage is BGE customers could go at a time, Potomac Edison customers could go at a time. So I do think that there are different ways that different customer slices could go, and that's the subject of today's discussion, I think.
Oh, it could, but I'm still struggling to see how that makes things any easier for us, because PEPCO is going to be the hardest nut. I mean, not the hardest nut to crack, but we all follow the same processes. So, if you're putting in the processes to deal with PEPCO, sure, it might give BGE and Potomac Edison a little more time, but we still have to get all the same processes developed in time to deal with it for PEPCO.
Understood. But if we say Potomac Edison customers and BGE customers are going to transition at this time, and it doesn't affect PEPCO's bid, then isn't that one way to perhaps transition?
If you do PEPCO or you do Potomac Edison and BGE customers first?
I'm just, that's.
I mean, that might.
And for the group's benefit, we were talking previously about, percentage. So for PE, Montgomery County total residential small commercial, it's between 14 and 15% on a customer account basis of our total.
And so just to clarify, the bid would be for 25% of that supply, because you have multiple bids in a year that overlap?
No, well, the bids also overlap over multiple years. So we have 15 residential tranches or bid blocks, however you want to term it. We have 2 small commercial tranches or bid blocks, and they are allocated across multiple bid windows over multiple years. So it's not a straight 25%.
And
okay, so that spreads the risk then.
Well, this is Bill again. What the supplier is signing up for is a percentage of the load. So one contract might be for 3% of the SOS load. And if that were the case, the utility might be doing, say, 8 of those contracts to get somewhere around a quarter of the total load. But each contract is 3%. That's 3% of the total load. And then if, for example, if Montgomery County left PE and 15% of that load left, whatever the supplier signed up for, their obligation would go down 15%. Maybe that explanation was too incomprehensible.
No, I mean, I got it, Bill, but I'm probably not. But I guess if you were to then start with, PE and BGE first, because it's unlikely that, or it's less likely that there's going to be a lot of an impact, or much impact, because just our load in Montgomery County, especially for BGE, is so small. So it's not, there's maybe less of a concern, but the problem is you still, we still have to have all the processes and everything in place to get to that point. And that's really, I think, where, that's what's going to take, the time. And so getting us to that point is, doing all that stuff to get to the point where you can have, BG and PE people, moving or being able to do the CCA. The everything to get to that point isn't any easier because it's BGE and PE. That's going to take the same amount of work no matter who's, going to go first, or if we're all going to go at the same time.
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to understand, Beverly. If the load for BGE, for example, is, I don't think you use the word insignificant, but it's a small part of BGE's total load. If that is not a material difference in the SOS process for BGE, this decision that apparently needs to be made by December so that there can be a filing with the commission by January may not have to be made. And we may not have to make that decision until the October bid, whatever month's backing up from the October bid. So that's just what I'm trying to understand, is what the various options might be there.
Well, and I guess I'm still struggling with maybe even what that decision is, that needs to be made in January.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, we may need to go back to staff to see if they can tell us what it would look like to phase in on start dates for this, because the point is, if there's going to be enough folks transitioning at the same time, and if it's going to be at the earliest start date, which is June of 2024, then the folks bidding SOS need to be advised, and there may be some changes that need to be made, not in this proceeding, but in another, to the SOS process, such that we minimize the amount of the unknown for that bid that's going to happen this April. If, however, we decide that maybe some portion starts in June and then some portion starts in October, or that we can't get our ducks in a row and it's all going to start in October, then there might not be such a rush to get this decision made in the next month and a half.
But
so
the decision is whether or not there needs to be changes to the SOS auction process.
Yeah, so we would need to get a filing to the commission saying, look, we think that, like, we have come to the decision that the CCA is going to go into effect on June 2024, or it's going to start in October of 2024, or X number of folks can June and X number of folks can transition in October, or whatever. I'm just throwing out. I mean, these are just my brainstorms, but so our PC54 needs to make a decision as to the start date and the mechanism for how this is going to start, the CCA, and file that with the commission so that the commission can decide what, if any, changes or what, if any, how that is going to affect the April 2022 bid process.
Judge Grace, if I could just, this is Phil again for staff, just maybe ask this question of folks, because I think staff was operating on the assumption that there was a general acceptance that it wouldn't be prudent to not address the potential for a lot of customers to switch away from SOS at some point in 24. I mean, I think we certainly are considering that if we don't do anything, if we just bid the SOS in April of 22 the same way we have done, all the time without making any changes to account for the fact that CCA might start operating during the period of the contract would be in effect. I think we assumed that everyone wanted to avoid just letting it happen and getting that price information, from the wholesale bidders, because I think there perhaps was a general idea that if we did nothing, that the bid prices would try to account for that uncertainty, which would result in higher prices for SOS. Is everybody still on the same page about that, or is that a bad assumption at this point?
That's clear to Montgomery County.
Yeah, this is Bill Fields. It's hard to see how, you could get a commitment to a firm date or a plan, for how this is going to go. For something that's going to start in 2024, to have a firm plan and commitment on that, December 2021, it's just hard to see how that's going to happen. So I think we are going to have to think about it, or somebody's going to have, maybe a different group is going to have to think about whether or not it makes sense to, to make changes to that process. I don't know what the answer to that question is right now.
All right, I wasn't getting a complete sense that everybody was in agreement about that. I think that's something we drew from the discussion of the previous meeting. And I maybe if we weren't clear about it, staff is not trying to address any implementation changes to utility systems in these first 3 meetings. We are solely talking about bringing the group to a discussion of, do we need to make changes to the SOS process, and in particular to the next SOS bid? Meaning, does that bid have to change in terms of the amount of load that's bid, or other changes to the terms of the contract that would somehow adjust, for the expectation that there's going to be a large number of customers, or a significant number of customers at least, dropping off SOS and moving to the CCA. So, Bev, I think you may have been asking some questions that I was perhaps getting the impression you were wanting to introduce the discussion of how the utility systems need to be implemented.
Well, I think, Phil, it's because I can't tell you that we'll be ready to do this by, and David Hoppa, can you please go on mute? Because I keep hearing crashing and it's hard to hear other people over it. It's hard for us to say that we'll be ready to do this by, the date that it's saying, without understanding kind of how all the implementation is going to work. Some of what's being discussed could require significant revisions to our underlying systems, not necessarily ones having to do with the SOS procurement, but, kind of just how things flow. And so I guess I'm uncomfortable with all this. Well, okay, we need to say that, it's going to be for the, April 2024 that we'll all be ready up to go. I can't tell you that, we're going to be ready to do that without knowing how we're going to implement this and then what changes it's going to take. I think that's where I'm getting concerned.
Are you comfortable saying not before June of 2024?
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Because the point is that the SOS bidders need to, up until June, that's our, the April bid that will affect up through June. So if we're saying that our goal is to get this by June, and we come to an agreement on that, and as we're writing our deliverable for the commission, if we say, starting June 2024, then we can get this decision under our belts and start working on all of the other questions we have to on implementation to make sure that we can, make it achievable by that date. But if we can't come to an agreement on start dates, then or like no sooner than or I don't know what folks are comfortable with, then we're stuck on this SOS question because there is going to be a bid in April and it is going to affect these dates. So, and honestly, it's definitely going to affect PE. And, we've already talked about the numbers for PEPCO. So what we're talking about today is, can we come to an agreement on what our target start date is? And can we come to an agreement on if it's going to be a phased in approach or if there's, some other method that we're using, so that we can then deal with the ancillary issue of this up and coming SOS bid.
So this is Stan Edwards from Montgomery County. I don't think we're prepared today to say when we would start. I think there's still some unanswered questions here about this, the percentage of customers that might transition under different scenarios. And so I think we will not be able to say that today. I'm also concerned that what I heard Beverly say was not related to SOS. It was related just to transition, and they may not be ready by, I don't know what date you said, June 24 or something. That's in essence putting a different deadline in the bill than the law, in the program than the law allows for. And I'm not saying that we're going to be ready by then, but that to me is setting an artificial deadline. Well, may not be artificial, but it's a deadline that the utilities are, at least, well, I'm not saying the utilities are saying, Beverly's suggesting that the utilities may not be ready. Whether we'll be ready or not, I don't know, but I don't think that the utility can say we're not ready, because that's not what the law says. But so
we have no idea who's going to be ready and who's not, because we haven't gone through and talked about the process.
But
Before
Jennifer, oh,
Can I chime in here before
Bev.
everybody goes in again? Okay. Well, one thing is just as I would look for some, this is Jorge, for some recommendation from the PSC staff about how perhaps other states who have been in similar situations in enabling legislation have approached this question of the SOS and timelines. So that's one thing. I think ultimately, right, the PSC is the one making this decision, and the staff is hearing different perspectives on it. I agree with Stan that it seems like there is another deadline being suggested by Beverly, and I just don't know. Again, like if in other places we'll have gone through this similar. I think Lori also put this in California. There were much bigger load of customers that were moved from one end to the other. I know the regulatory scheme there is different, but that's sort of the other thing that I was hoping we would have a conversation about, instead of just sort of making a choice right now about the dates.
I'll weigh in, and I'm not an expert, but it's not my understanding that with other states, they did it kind of where we've got the bill in Maryland, where Maryland put these dates out there and then said, go figure it out to get to those dates. I thought in the other states it was more of a, okay, start figuring it out, working it out, and then, you know, as you're figuring it out, figure out when you can start. So I think that's one big difference that we have, that there wasn't the, okay, you need to get it done by such and such a date, like we have in our bill, you know. I think that was a big difference. It was people were working it out, working through these issues, and we're able to say, okay, well, you know, knowing it's going to take, you know, 2 years or 18 months to do the system changes, we can, you know, time it this way. That means the first auction that would be impacted would be this one. Okay, you kind of were able to put it out that way. You didn't have the, you know, this whatever the dates are on the bill.
Beverly, that may be true, but the bill, I mean, having followed this
Oh,
for
I know.
the past
Well,
2 years, yeah.
you
So no,
asked
let
what
me,
the other states did, and I'm just
sure, sure.
explaining that the other states didn't have this complication. So
But
I'm
let
just
me add.
saying,
So let me add. I hear you. The bill was actually originally meant to launch the CCA even faster. And from my understanding, the PSC and even some folks in the utilities sort of agreed to this timeline. So again, I don't know if, you know, these
well,
questions came up then or not, but that's what I'm saying. I guess this is where it's up to sort of the PSC to kind of
I won't get
ultimately make
to
a decision on that.
Th-
Sure.
This is
the
Jeff
sort of
Trout.
sausage
I
making
want to,
of bills, but
Hang on, folks. So, we have a lot of decisions that we're gonna have to make. A lot of decisions. And those decisions are gonna affect our timeline in general. The very first decision we have to make is what our target start date is gonna be. And is that target start date gonna be a single start date, or is it gonna be a staged start date? So staff today nobody's suggesting that anybody has to make a decision today. Not a single person. What we're suggesting is that we have to make a decision in the next month and a half. We have to make a decision in the next month. And we're going to have several meetings over the next month. Today, staff has prepared a deck of slides to start this discussion. And we've only gotten through the first couple of slides. I would like to turn this over to staff to talk about what a transition might look like that's all at once, and what that might look like if it's over a period of time. So David, can you pull up the next slide talking about transition options, please? And I'll turn it over to Phil.
Thank you, Judge Grace. And I think I think maybe we can explain. Our next meeting is when we would maybe like folks to have come back and thought about a couple of the options and maybe start to give us a feel for what's an acceptable selection of timing and the manner in which the transition occurs. So we have the end of the slide. We are kind of reminding folks we're looking for some feedback written by December 8th. I know it's a fast turnaround, but just so folks can see it, and then hopefully we have sort of meaningful discussion at the next meeting. All right, so I don't know if this is cart before the horse, but we are first talking about the manner of the transition with a very simplistic approach being either a staged or a single. After this, we are talking a little bit about the timing of it and those sorts of issues. All we're attempting to do with this slide here is just lay out some very high level options. The first of which is either staging, a portion of accounts over some period of time, or attempting to allow all of the accounts to switch either, in a very short period of time, or possibly even a single day if that's something that's manageable. But just kind of going through sort of some description of what this looks like. When we're talking about a staged transition versus a single transition, the staged is breaking the transition into pieces. Those pieces could be equal, or they could be start small and get bigger, as you sort of are able to manage the the amount that's happening, and that could be for the scale of it, or the change in the portions of customers that are switching over time. Could relate to technical issues about increasing capability for managing larger amounts of customers switching at the same time, or it could relate to managing the SOS wholesale bidders risk associated with facing an uncertain amount of load that they're bidding on, and issues that they would have to be able to price accurately and know how much they're pricing to serve. So the size of the stages, the timing of the stage, I don't have the specific reference to the law, but I believe there is a feature in the legislation that allows the commission to have discretion to sort of set the timing of the transition up to a 2-year period. And then another fairly simple discussion here that we talked about probably last time is switching the residential and small commercial. I know that one other, Dave, I guess we didn't put it into this one, but I think we also talked about, given that Montgomery County has different political subdivisions, or maybe cities, or some of the incorporated towns. We didn't talk about this before, but but possibly that's another way to break it up, in addition to what we mentioned earlier today, which was maybe switching the different service territories within the county eligible customers. All right.
Bill, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Would it be possible to switch by, account numbers? I mean, if there's 200,000 accounts in Pepco territory, to take 50,000 accounts. I mean, is that a feasible way to do it, or?
So we have not attempted to evaluate this on like the technical implementation issue. I think when we talk about pros and cons later on, one of the issues that came to mind is that customers, they're getting these letters, and they may want to know why. Well, their neighbor got a letter to switch and they didn't get one, and when are they going to get theirs? So, making it easy to understand. It's like if you live in the city of Bethesda or Rockville or what have you, you're all going to switch on this date. If you live outside that, you'll switch on a different date. I think we were, quite possibly it could be done. We would alphabetically, possibly. Who knows? We were just trying to come up with just a very high level. We certainly haven't considered all options, or we haven't determined which options are technically feasible or not.
Okay.
So certainly looking for, and possibly the folks who are familiar with transitions that have occurred in other service or in other jurisdictions, other states, maybe they will have some thoughts about that they can share with us at some point either today or after. All right, so the single transition would sort of has maybe some options associated with how that would work. But what that means, I think, in our thought here is that basically once you've identified your eligible customers through the various means that are laid out in the legislation to do that, that they would switch simultaneously, or as close to simultaneous as what works out feasibly on a technical basis. This, I think, is something that we had a concern about, simply because it's very different than what has been done thus far in the experience switching customers from retail choice. So I mean, most of the utilities in the residential are somewhere plus or minus 20% switched, and I think most of those switching, there was probably a large amount of switching that occurred when purchase receivables picked up in like 2011 or 12 or something like that. But no one's experienced anything like 200,000 customers switching during a single month, as far as I know. All right, so in the slide that Dave has up now, just a couple other staging options. using a percentage or switching by municipality, switching by zip codes. I think some of the options that look at breaking it into something that makes it easy for a customer to understand when they're eligible, and when they can, most people probably know what their zip code is, or they know if they live in the town or in the county or something like that. The timing of the stages, like I mentioned before, the legislation appears to limit the maximum length to a 2-year period after the startup. And then I think primary option that we looked at that seemed to make a lot of sense is simply switching in synchronization with the end of SOS contracts, not for a particular technical reason, but for reasons associated with minimizing risk associated with the wholesale bid. All right, and then moving on to the next slide, Dave. The transition options for single. Again, I don't know that we need to get into the technical issues associated with, is it possible to switch on a single date, or would the switching have to occur over a month, on each meter read date, or if we're switching large amounts of customers, would there be some other form of batch processing that would occur such that, the target might be April 1st, but you'll start switching and you'll switch over the first week or so, just to break it into manageable sizes. That's probably more of a part of the discussion that would address whether or not how the utilities are going to go ahead and implement the switching. So, just from a high level standpoint, this switching either on a all at once basis, which has its benefits, and then we're switching over a period of time, which has a different set of benefits. Those are the two high level options that we came up with, and to the extent that there are others, we certainly want to hear about those whenever it's appropriate for folks. Questions or comments just on that, or do you want to? We can just talk about timing, which I think we've covered a lot already. I'll keep going unless there's other questions. All right. So I think at the very beginning of our presentation, we talked about the potential for switching to occur as early as mid-February in 2024. As far as we could tell, obviously a lot of things have to fall in place for that to happen, but that would be the earliest that it appears the legislation would permit that to occur. And then the other two kind of very simple options that we're looking at would be switching that starts with the end of either the contract that ends at the end of May of 24, or the contract that ends at the end of September 24. We've already talked about this. All right. So in order to not, and this might be a lot to absorb at this place, I think what we had proposed in the agenda that we circulated at the previous meeting is that maybe we would have some discussion of comments that folks would have about the kind of the pros and cons for each of these two different options. I think we want to allow, certainly, if there was any other options that folks wanted to kind of bring up from experience in other places, or if perhaps Montgomery County has some other thoughts about how you might want to break this up. This was simply our first crack at how this might work. Understanding we didn't.
Hi, this is Kevin from AO, but just real quick on the switching, I would think would make more sense to just switch based on meter read date, the same way that a third-party supplier switches when a customer signs a third-party supplier in the enrollment process. We don't need to. I don't think we want to start adding additional costs for this CCA and changing all the rules, and just treat it as if the CCA is almost a quasi third-party supplier at that point. They follow the same rules that all the other third-party suppliers do. The switch occurs on the meter read date and the month of enrollment. That way we don't have separate processes for the utilities to deal with. It's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Tim.
This is Stan. I think it would be helpful just to know from the utility perspective about these options, about, you know, doing it by zip code or by geographic area or by meter number, and how many, you know, could you break? It seems to me meter numbers would be the most effective, because I would think that's what the utilities need to be able to transition, as opposed to an address, but I could be wrong. But just knowing whether that transition is better done in 3 pieces or 5 pieces, or can be done in 10 pieces, or whether that makes a difference, that would be helpful for us to know.
This is Robbie from PHI. Just one point of clarification. We don't switch on the meter reading date anymore. We have accelerated switching. So within 3 days, that account will switch to a third-party supplier.
Okay, thanks, Robbie.
Mm-hmm.
Robbie, do you have any sense of are the limitations? Do we need to think about switching volumes that might have a limitation?
I think we would. I'm not sure if our system can handle 200,000 at one time, but I don't know for sure. But it seems to me that would be quite a lot for the EDI translation.
And I mean, I think we are planning to talk about sort of the implementation specifics in, I guess, meetings like 4, 5, and 6. But one of the issues that probably is important for that is to understand whether or not that initial switch will occur using something where the utility would be receiving enrollments for all of those, or if the utility would be sort of, you know, pre-populating the eligible customers in some way, and switching without having received the enrollment. You know.
Yeah, that sounds too manual to do it that way. So I think we would need the actual enrollment transaction to switch them.
Okay, well, like I said, I didn't want to. That's definitely
Yeah.
something we will need to consider. But
Right.
today's discussion, I think we were simply trying to address what are the impacts of switching on the SOS bid process, because that was the kind of first thing that was hitting. All right. So on the pros and cons, you know, I think what we're trying to do here is, you know, I know staff, you know, we have probably had some ideas about this, but really, you know, depending on the stakeholders in the working group, with insight into how the various systems at the utility are affected, how the wholesale bidding process is affected, and also how customers themselves might react, you know, to switching, and maybe, you know, in particular, the ones that are sort of being or that have not opted out but are switching by default because they didn't react to, or they weren't already switched on retail choice, or they didn't act to themselves on SOS or something of that nature. So, Dave, I think we can go. We go to the next slide. This sort of putting together some thoughts about what would be better or worse about the approaches for switching in a kind of a single switch versus a stage switch. I think with the single switch, what seemed to us that it might be easy for customers to become aware of when the switch is going to occur if it was all happening at the same time, and that might make it easier for customer education, and it would, you know, not create a situation where, you know, customers expecting to switch and didn't because, you know, that wasn't their zip codes month to switch, or they weren't in the first phase. So just from a simplicity standpoint, it seemed to be a single switch might have been better. Some of the negatives for switching at the same time might be technical, and then certainly, you know, issues with acting the standard offer service process and the we've talked about. Staging over a period of time, and a smaller impact on SOS, and I think we're looking at that as having some greater opportunity for customers to not expecting the switch when it happens, or expecting to be switched and it doesn't happen because they're not in the same.
Bill, this is Lori. I'd like to raise another pro and con here related to equity. The presumption in doing a CCA is that there's benefit to the customer because of a beneficial rate. And so there may be an equity issue if some customers can avail themselves of that beneficial rate sooner than other customers. So I think there's an equity piece to this pro and con analysis.
Okay, and just to make sure, you would view the single switch to be more fair to everyone, so they're all getting the presumably better price at the same time.
Yeah, or at least dividing it between residential and commercial. So, again, you brought up the neighbors talking to neighbors. There may be the, wait a minute, especially if it takes 2 years to make the switch over. I mean, that's where you're really going to feel that pinch, is if it is over such a long period of time that some customers will go a whole year or 2 without being able to be part of the CCA.
That's a good point. I don't think we pick up on that, but we will add that to our list for sure.
Yeah, well, Phil, this is Drew McCall from staff. I would just say there could be an equity issue on the other side. If the transition is too quick and the SOS bidders have to hedge their bids, there may be SOS price increases for customers not involved in the CCA. So, for example, PG County residents. So I would just offer that kind of counterpoint that there could be equity issues on the other side as well.
All right, thanks, Drew.
AOBA concurs with that concern about PG County and how that unwittingly they will be affected by this CCA.
All right. Anyone else on that? And again, if there are folks who have some insights into this, I think there's definitely a little bit of time to kind of collect your thoughts, but we are looking for folks to kind of provide some written feedback by December 8th, so that we have that discussion on. All right. There's nothing further on single versus stage, but I think we've already talked about a lot of the pros and cons relative to start date, but just to focus on that again. Dave, starting earlier versus starting later, where later is sort of maybe starting October 24. We're sort of not really thinking here in terms of start dates that are anything other than like on June 1 or on October 1 and 24, but that's really just for simplicity of organizing the issue rather than whether or not it might make sense to actually spread this out so that the whole thing switches over during that time period or something of that nature. But starting earlier, bring the benefits associated with the CCA, if that's better pricing, if that's a greener source of electricity, the earlier you start, the sooner the customers get those. Cons being, we have to be sort of careful to make sure that any changes to the SOS bid process don't, create price or other sorts of problems for the non-participants that are in service territory, particular Prince George's County. So, and starting in October 24 later, it gives us a lot more time relative to having to deal with this issue next month. But to the extent that we determine that it's better to start a little bit later, we can skip a bid tranche to have to worry about. That may be a slight assumption. There's still maybe some other impacts, even if we are letting folks know that we're not going to start with June 1, but we're going to wait until after rates come in. It gives, starting later, gives us more time for all the other issues. This is, maybe something that Stan, the folks in Montgomery County, I don't know if you've made any sort of like timeline internally for managing your internal processes for setting the CCA up and managing your getting all those things squared away prior to making the commission filing. But certainly there's some benefits there. And then obviously, any longer delay keeps the implementation from benefiting customers. Anyone want to comment on pros and cons relative to the start date that we haven't already picked up on, or want to go back and size anything? All right. If not, I think we can move to the next slide. And I think we've already talked about this quite a bit, but the SOS, process. We've now established that we actually have a shorter time frame than I think what staff thought about when we put this timeline together. The commission is actually looking for decisions early January, and so we sort of have to make a decision in December. Maybe Judge Grace, you probably are already thought about the timelines. I think we have a meeting scheduled for the 28th of December. I think staff was thinking, based on our discussion from last week, that falling during the holiday week we would not have, and we'd be deciding on having our next meeting January 4th. Maybe when we get back to talking about next steps, next meetings, we can figure out if we're sticking with the December 14th and the December 28th meeting in order to get that timeline squared away so we can get something to the commission.
I'd like to see what written responses we receive by December 8th to see if there's any chance of us coming to an agreement on this, and then we can address when the last meeting in December, or whether or not it'll be moved to January 4th at that time.
Okay.
This is where we put in the work in the work group. Talk to our folks, whoever it is we have to talk to, do our research, consider what the best way to implement this is, and come back with some detailed analysis or some detailed proposals for the rest of the group to consider. If everyone can get it emailed to me by December 8th, I can get it out December 9th. We'll have plenty of time to bring that back to your folks and talk about what everybody's suggestions were, so that we can have a really good discussion on December 14th. And we can make a decision at that point whether or not we need to keep that December 28th meeting or not.
All right. Good. So Dave, if you move to the next slide, now these, sort of getting to the specifics of what could potentially change. The case 9064, I think that is both residential and a small commercial. I don't think type 2 is 9052, but we're not dealing with that. So kind of on the left side there, just sort of thinking at a fairly high level, the types of changes that potentially could present wholesale bidders with a more clear picture of what the risks of the CCA implementation would have might be to change the length of the contracts. And again, you sort of have to know, are you starting before June 1? Are you starting on June 1? Are you starting after June 1? To kind of figure out precisely what you would need there. So, changing the contract length so that if load isn't needed, it wouldn't be the wholesale bidders would essentially truncate those so that the contracts would end. So even though what we bid in April was going to end in September of 24, maybe a portion of those bids would be for a shorter length. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I'm certainly looking for input on that from folks who are more familiar with that process. Changes to the block sizes, sort of to shrink the amount of total megawatts that are being bid by kind of making all of the pieces smaller. If there's kind of an assumption about the amount of the CCA load that expected to show up. And then the third possibility that we kind of thought of is there a manner to change the way SOS contracts deal with increments or decrements to load? That's probably something we need to think about going forward, even after the initial setup, because we probably don't know a whole lot now about how long customers would stay with the CCA, if there's going to be any significant amount of customers coming back to SOS, or if retail contracts might be impacted, either taking customers away from SOS or adding customers back to SOS. So that's something that probably is a little more technically detailed. Folks are very familiar with the CCA process.
Bill, Stan, can I ask a question about this bullet? Your first bullet here about adjustments to contract length, that makes sense to me, that's a process that the PSC would want to weigh in on. It would change what's been done for years. And I guess the second bullet gets to the question I was asking earlier. Is there a change in the block size that would not have to go through the PSC approval process, and one that would? In other words, if we were to transition a small enough percentage or transition in BGE and PE and part of PEPCO that would not significantly alter the normal SOS process, such that the PSC would have to go under case 9064 and have some discussion about that? Or is it any change is still going to require this process? That was my question.
Maybe pose that question to if there are, I am not familiar with or familiar enough with the procurement improvement process. Is there someone on the call who would maybe want to describe how the number of blocks and the size of the blocks are determined? Is that done annually, or have those been set for some period of time? Bill Fields, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I was hoping one of the utility people would jump in, but those block sizes they're part of a plan that's approved by the commission every early fall, and it's a plan for the year of procurements. Starting in October and then January, April, June. Those hopefully that adds up to four procurements are part of a plan that have a block size. Now, like I said before, the block sizes are percentages that add up. The whole point is that the percentages all add up to 100%. I'm not quite sure what the changes to the block sizes would be that would help this situation. I mean, well, after the CCA starts, if you're doing a procurement knowing that this load is, not going to be there from the very beginning, then yeah, you might change the block sizes so that, you change the percentages so that that percentage works out to be a block size of around 50 megawatts. That's easier for the wholesale suppliers to deal with. But I don't have a good idea at this point of how you adjust those block sizes for the April procurement that helps the situation, because the block sizes are going to make sense for the beginning of the contract. It's the end of those contracts where those block size percentages are going to be, instead of 50 megawatts, they could be, 30, 40, somewhere in there, depending on how this is done. They could be a much lower number of megawatts for the same percentage. That's something that we're, actively thinking about, but just don't have any good ideas at this point on what to do to help that situation.
Right. And I guess, Bill, what I'm trying to understand is, and I apologize if I'm not explaining myself clearly, but is this, so I understand that block sizes might change for the April auction. And that the bidders would want to know that. They'd want to know the block size change before then. And what I'm trying to understand is their timing of knowing that the same as the process that is required under case 9064? In other words, is that what is the case 9064 what's driving the timeline here, the decision timeline, or is it the what the bidders need to know about what they're bidding on? And if just changing the block size is not a material change in the process, I'm trying to figure out if there's a case 9064 issue here, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah, well, to make any changes to the block size or the procurement plan for the utility, there would have to be a 9064 proceeding, because those plans are approved in detail by the commission.
Okay.
Now, it's not impossible. I mean, if the commission approved it, they can approve something different.
No,
how much lead time? How much lead time is reasonable to give the suppliers with that new information? You know, the plan. I can tell you this: the plan gets approved in early September, and the first auction, the first procurement is in mid-October. That's the usual schedule. So that's about a month or so lead time on the approval of the whole of the plan in the first place. Now, the plan is filed in late August, so it's something that people know about, but it's not officially approved until, like I said, usually mid-September. So that's about a month of lead time there.
But it does sound like
Hey, Bill.
Based on what you're saying, that change would have to have this 9064 procedure. So that is the driving timeline, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think any change to the procurement would need to be approved under 9064.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hey, real quick, guys. Good conversation. But remember that the base PLC for bid block is not set until for Potomac Edison or the first day of delivery. So the bid plan that we put out is a review of what's available generally at the time the bid plan is put together, and we do updates for each procurement. So that gives the suppliers ability to analyze what the shopping percentages have been and how they're going to take that, shopping risk into account as part of their bid. But the base PLC that they get assigned is not done until the first day of the delivery of the contract. So I just wanted to make that distinction as you guys were talking about this. So our bid plan might say that there's, I'll make it up, 600 megawatts of residential available. But when we get to the first day of delivery, it might be 550. And that's what sets the PLC per tranche at that point.
Well, right. And the supplier, whatever percentage the supply, whatever percentage is assigned to the block, that will
they own that percentage.
Right.
That's exactly right. But as you guys are talking, I don't know if you're talking past each other or not, but I just wanted to make it clear that the actual load that's in the bid plan is an estimate of what's available at the time that was created.
Oh, yeah.
But Bill is
that's
correct. Each bid block for residential for Potomac Edison, there's 14 bid blocks, which equals 6.7% of the total residential load, and then there's one bid block at 6.2%. So whatever is available of the residential load on any given day, they get 6.7%, except for that last block, which is 6.2%. But I just didn't want us to get too hung up on the idea of what the estimated value as part of the bid plan was. As Bill is stating correctly, it's the percentage of the load that you have to think about. or what that bid block represents of the total load.
Bob, this is Phil from staff. Are you sort of, and maybe I'm reading something into this that you're not actually saying, but does that sort of imply that if we did nothing, that the bidders would sort of understand that the CCA is in play and there could be a shift, which might be a lot bigger than what they would expect to see based on what you're telling them about the retail switching experience, but that the existing sort of procurement plan allows for even something like that big to change?
Oh, sure. The existing plan does allow for something that big to change. So as I think about this, and I'm still wrestling with all the things everybody else is in my mind, but whether we go in and ask for some dramatic change to SOS or not, until, and I think Dan Tudor is the one that brought this up earlier, the suppliers are still not going to know, regardless of what we do, how much load's going to change, because they're not going to know how many people are going to opt out. They don't know how many people are going to shop with a Crest supplier instead. So until you get close to day one, there's going to be uncertainty. So they price in that uncertainty today based on history. Well, this is a brand new thing. So I'm still wrestling in my mind, no matter what gyrations we take, are we really going to help mitigate the exposure of the SOS price? I'm just not so sure that we are, no matter what we do, because that risk is going to still exist until customers actually make a definitive decision.
I agree with everything Bob just said. This is Dan again. Yeah. Well laid out, Bob.
So I guess maybe we need folks to think about this, but I think we're operating with the assumption that there's some way to isolate the CCA kind of switching risk from the rest of the SOS bid process. And maybe there isn't, or maybe there's not a way to do it particularly well. But I sort of asked this before, I think we're still operating under the assumption that we should make some attempt to minimize the risk to the other customers that won't be participating in the CCA, who are on standard offer service, both in the Montgomery County territory and in the other jurisdictions within. It
does seem to me, I understand what Bob's saying. It does seem to me, however, the risk is much less. If you're uncertain whether 200,000 customers are going to have the option for the CCA or not have the option for the CCA, that's one level of risk. But if you know that they have the option and then some percentage of them might not opt into it, they might stay with SOS. That's a much smaller percentage, I would assume, and so the uncertainty is less. But I understand what he's saying, that there still may be an impact. There's still uncertainty there.
Phil, if I may, this is David Bloom with BG, and with everything that's just been said, there's an assumption that I think is driving the uncertainty, and that's the assumption that we're starting on or about June 1st, 2024. I think it goes without saying, and I'm not suggesting that this is what we're talking about here, but if you allow for the 2-year transition to go into effect much more longer into the future, then you can begin to manage these risks for the suppliers a little bit better. The 2-year that's written into the law, I think, is to allow for the period of time beyond the SOS procurement.
So this is Lori. I still would like to understand, and so I think this is a request to staff, maybe the utilities, is because the risk appears to be quite different for the utilities. Again, PEPCO's in one category, but I think if I have the numbers right, BG&E has about 13,000 customers in Montgomery County of maybe 1.3 million across the state. So it's a small percentage. And then Potomac Edison, I think you said it's 14 to 15% of your customers. So it would be helpful as we think about stretching the phasing over a period of time and how we do phasing. It would be helpful to know and have a better appreciation for how it impacts each utility differently.
That's a good point, Laura. I guess we have to maybe ask the utility folks to try to incorporate something like that into their response for next week. It's possible.
Can I just, this is Taylor Beckham from PHI. I just want to see if I can clarify what Laura is asking here. I heard you say in a phasing process. Do you want to know how it would impact the utilities if, you know, the group decided to go from just a stage transition to a single transition? I'm trying to just understand exactly what it is you're asking.
If I could just weigh in here, I think I agree with Lori that it would be useful to have these numbers. If you look at BGE, for example, if I heard the numbers right, 13,000 accounts out of 1.6 million, if that's roughly correct, that's less than 1% of BGE's load. So it seems to me that, I mean, again, I don't know what sort of risk they build in, but it seems to me they would assume that 1% might go in and out of retail supply in any given thing. So sounds like Potomac Edison's going to be a little bit more. The larger percentage of the total customer base, obviously Pepco, it's a significant portion. So we understand that, but understanding how what percentage of the Montgomery County customers make up of the utility territories would be important, and to get a better understanding how that might affect the SOS bid. And then on Pepco, again, it seems to me, even knowing if you transitioned 10% or 25%, if we just knew more about the customer base, the total customer base, the percentage of Montgomery County, and how that might be able to be broken down into blocks that would perhaps reduce the risk of transition, and perhaps that transition can be done over cycles. But without having some data, it's difficult, I think, to assess that.
Utilities can certainly provide data about the customers in Montgomery County, you know, what their makeup are and all that. But we don't know. I think the suppliers would have to be the ones to weigh in on what level of, you know, change. I mean, we can certainly weigh it against what's ever in the contract and what would happen that way. But I don't know that we can say if BGE lost all 14,000 customers for the last 2 months, what that would do to a bid price. We don't have that kind of insight into what, you know, what a supplier would do. Yeah, I don't know if we have any wholesale suppliers on the phone currently. But that's, you know, we get the bids from the suppliers. We don't have any, you know, input in or, you know, insight into, you know, what's behind that. Again, we can give you, you know, if you want to look at, you know, how many customers by zip code, how many, I think we've already provided the residential and commercial breakdown. You know, we certainly can do that. But as for the impact it would, you know, anything would have, you know, I'm not an expert in this stuff, and I'd love for my folks to weigh in, but I just don't know how we make any kind of, you know, guess about what the impact would be.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bev. Even though Pepco is going to have a bigger impact, even though it's going to be a bigger impact, there's no way to know exactly how suppliers will adjust their risk premium exactly. It's impossible to calculate.
Yeah, I appreciate that. My assumption, though, is that if you know that 50% of your customers might leave, that's going to have a bigger impact than if it's 0.8%, which is what I calculated BGE to be if those numbers are right. So I think we could, you know, if we're going to make the assumption that this large transition is going to have a big impact, I think we can equally make the assumption that the small transaction is going to have less of an impact. And so it would just be helpful to have the numbers if, I mean, I would assume they're available.
Numbers from the utilities would be really useful with deciding how to phase in if we go that route.
Yeah.
As far as the amount of risk, that's not for us to decide. What we need to do and focus on is make sure that this pilot does not increase SOS bids, because we need to minimize the amount of variables. So our duties, I guess, right now within the next month and a half are to try to come up with a decision on when to implement and how to implement, i.e. phase in, if that's what we're going to do, so that we can provide the information to the commission, and also so that SOS bidders have that information so they can determine their amount of risk. The way I see it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems to me that, you know, Bob earlier had mentioned the uncertainty about even when you transition, you don't know how many customers are going to stay in. But it seems to me there's some possibilities here that we could learn from. So suppose we and I'm just throwing this out there as an example. I'm not suggesting that this would be done, but suppose we transitioned BGE customers first. And I know it's a small customer base, but I don't think they're particularly different than Pepco or PE customers from the standpoint of how they might react. And we might see that of the 14,000 customers that were transitioned to CE, 1% decided to stay with SOS, and that might then guide us for how to transition the other utilities or other sectors. So I think having the numbers and understanding what relative risk we might be taking is valuable.
This is Drew McCall from staff. I would just say with your hypothetical scenario that the SOS bids would have already occurred, because they're bid over the 2-year period. So I think your idea is reasonable, but I'm just saying I think some of those SOS bids would have already gone in. So these suppliers probably would have already hedged some of those bids and therefore probably would have had higher prices. But I think your idea is a reasonable one to kind of get an idea of how many switch. Then another point, I had a question for Pepco, really, considering they have the largest customer base. I was curious if they'd be able to switch customers by billing cycle, because I believe you have 21 billing cycles. And with approximately 200,000 customers, we could phase in, approximately 10,000 a month if you did one billing cycle each month. Would that be a possibility for staging the transition?
I'm going to say no at this point because we have that logic taken out due to accelerated switching. So we have to put that logic back into the system, which is at a cost.
Okay, so you're saying there'd be a cost to switch your system to recognize the billing cycle?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Because right now, because in Maryland, we have accelerated switching, 3-day switching.
Right. I'm just saying, is that one way to at least identify customers, considering there's 21 billing cycles? It seems like a nice, relatively round number of 10,000 customers per billing cycle. So you still could use that as a way to identify customers to switch each month?
That I don't know. So you're saying just to identify those, because they like an RG in cycle number 1, how many customers are in Montgomery County?
Correct. Yeah, just as an identifier, yes.
Okay, identify. I'm sure we probably could, but don't quote me on that. I have to go back and check on that.
But I guess would that be, I thought someone expressed concern about, just doing it randomly, because I don't know that, again, you could be your neighbor and, if this matters, but, bill cycles aren't necessarily geographic anymore.
True, correct, exactly.
And so, it could be that I get to switch 1 month, my next door neighbor isn't switching, eligible to switch for 4 months. And I don't know that a lot of customers really understand the concept of our bill groups. I mean, we could explain it, but that could be confusing. But it is.
I think I think communication about this is going to be challenging
Right.
across the board. So I think that's something we could probably explain if that made sense from other perspectives. So I wouldn't have that as a reason to not explore this concept. Because we're gonna have communication challenges no matter how we do this.
Yeah, I agree with you, Stan. Yeah. So Bev, I hear exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
probably gonna be
no,
confusing
that's-
any way we do it. So.
Stan, this is David Bloom from BGE. I just wanted to go back to your hypothetical about transitioning only BGE customers in Montgomery County. Could you just explain again sort of what the benefit or what you'd be hoping to learn from that? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, I mean, if I heard correctly from what Bob said, that once we we're trying to reduce uncertainty by deciding when customers would be transitioned to the CCA. And even if we have that figured out, once they're transitioned, we don't know how many customers might say, I don't want to be involved in this. I want to stay with SOS, or I'm going to an alternative retail supplier. And I was just thinking that doing a transition of a smaller number of customers might give us some insight to how many customers would in fact make that transition. And then when we do when a subsequent SOS bid occurs, the bidders might have a better idea of how to assume a transition.
Okay, thanks. And what about from, I appreciate taking the perspective of SOS suppliers and their participation in the auction. What about though the CCA's perspective? And I know you may not be prepared to comment on that, but this is probably the theme in our response. But what would the CCA's perspective be, you think, on learning about transitioning a BGE territory first, or being able to prepare an offer? Have you given that any thought?
You mean from the standpoint of the electricity we're procuring?
Yeah, ultimately the offer that you'd be making to the customers.
Yeah. I don't know how that. Yeah, I'm not sure of the ramifications of that, David. I guess I couldn't answer that at this point. One thing I would say is that part of your question, I think, is we have in setting up the Montgomery County and setting up our program, we have an obligation and a desire to do certain things for our customers. But we also, and I think I've expressed this, it's not our desire to harm other customers that are staying in the SOS, that don't have an option to go in or out of the SOS of the CCA. So Prince George's County customers, for example, it's not our desire to impact them negatively. So to the extent we can get information that would help the SOS bidders understand how to reduce the amount of risk they have and have better bids, that's in our interest as well. But I understand the other issue about how does that affect what we're purchasing, and I guess I can't answer that at this point. Or I know I can't answer that at this point.
This is Bill Fields, and I would just add to Stan's list about what you might learn. And I'm not suggesting whether it's a good idea to to do BGE first or not. But one thing that I've been wondering about is how much bounce back you might get after the CCA, after the customers are transitioned to begin with, because no matter how much how much communication you do, there's still going to be many customers who don't pay any attention to this until it actually happens. And then, what I'm wondering is how many customers get switched to the CCA and then soon thereafter want to switch back to SOS, or maybe they switch to another supplier. But I'm also wondering about how much bounce back you might get.
Yeah, that's what I was assuming we could maybe learn if we did it a phase sort of transition like that. And I just want to be clear, I was just throwing out transition BGE as an example. I'm not proposing that either. So.
Ken, when you're talking about using BGE as an example first, and then using that to inform how to transition, say, Gedeson's territory or PEPCO's, that would imply that if the BGE transition, say, in June of 24, kind of observed how that went, for the first couple of months, you wouldn't be able to transition PEPCO, for example, for, a time period that would allow for the next tranche of bids. I mean, that could be 2 years later or something. I'm not trying to calculate that. That might mean that if you wait to see how well it works with PG&E, you'd be transitioning Pepco territory in like 26 or
Well,
something.
yeah, I'm not. So I got to go back and look at that spreadsheet and when things transition and how much, of the load would be transitioned. And I think there's a lot of factors in that. I'm suggesting that there may be a way to learn from the first wave of transition, how much value that brings and how that process might work. I haven't thought fully through yet, but.
Okay. So I'm just wondering, for the various folks that are participating, is it reasonable to maybe think that folks could come back with a preferred selection of these options, or at least some sort of a general feel for how they would prefer this to work in terms of the timing and whether or not it's staged or single, so that we have something to discuss next time? Is that something the utility folks would be able to come back with? Is that something that Montgomery County would be able to come back with, looking at the various permutations, solely based on the discussions we've had up to this point, really? What can folks come back with next, or on the 8th, for example, in written comment, so that we can discuss? Is that a reasonable expectation that the stakeholders would be able to come back with a method that they would prefer, or at least some of the options they would prefer?
So I'm going to add to that. From the utilities, it'd be nice to have an idea of the CCA eligible accounts, which would be obviously residential and small business, and in Montgomery County versus elsewhere. And it would also be nice if the utilities could think about, if we were going to bunch folks to have separate start dates, what would be the easiest way for the utility to do that? Would it be by zip code? Would it be residential folks first? What would be the easiest way for each respective utility to make that change? So let me just add that in there.
And I think from Montgomery County's perspective, to have some of that data and the answer to some of those questions would help us understand what the ramifications would be of doing it at one time or in stages. Again, recognizing that we have an interest in doing right by Montgomery County customers, but also doing right by the SOS customers that remain. So, but I think having some of those answers would help us understand that a little better.
From my perspective, I don't feel like Montgomery County can sit this one out. We need to know from Montgomery County what you're thinking about by way of, are you thinking about the earliest possible start date, which I guess if things were pushed through could be as early as March as 2023, and really not looking at anything else beyond June? Or are you considering multiple start dates? Montgomery County really can't sit this one out. We need a response from Montgomery County.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting we sit this out. I'm suggesting give us some data that helps us understand the ramifications of that.
If Montgomery County waits to get the data from the utilities on December 8th or 9th, I'm not sure that we'll have anything from Montgomery County before the 14th, such that the other stakeholders can take a look at it and see what they think is being proposed. So Montgomery County may not have a full answer by the 8th, but we would be asking that Montgomery County submit something in writing and participate in the decision-making process and let us know where you're at.
Okay.
Judge Grace, I'm looking. I could swear that BGE, and I can't speak for the other utilities, I thought we actually provided data to staff. I'm trying to, yeah, I think
Beth,
we gave,
yep, we did. This is David
yeah,
Bloom. We did provide the staff already.
yeah, I mean, I think,
Bev, is that something you could send me and I can just send out to the group really quick?
yeah, you know, I think it doesn't have our totals. It just gives, the BGE, like the stuff, it's specific for Montgomery County, but I wonder if we could add in so that there's a comparison against like what our total is, because it's got like the number of customers on SOS in Montgomery County and the number, you know, maybe we could provide add in the comparable data for the whole system so that you can see, you know, kind of the relative piece. So yeah, I think we'll try and get that added, and then we'll just send it around to the whole group, and I think that's probably shouldn't be too long to get. We can do that probably this week, and people probably beat me for offering that up, but I mean,
That would be
certainly,
great.
actually, I mean, I can send around, actually, how about I send around what we provided to staff already, and then we'll work on getting what I think is the additional information that's needed, and then we'll send that around as soon as we can.
That would be great. Thank you so much. That would give people an opportunity to take a look at it prior to the 8th.
Yep.
Judge
Your
Grace,
Honor, I was just gonna say, I think PHI is in the same boat. We're just checking to make sure exactly what it is that we sent over, but I don't think it'll be a hard thing for us to get back out to the group today or tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Judge Grace, if I could respond to what you just said, with all due respect, Montgomery County hasn't been sitting out this process. We've been very engaged. You're asking us to make a decision for something that's 2 years down the road without the regulations that would govern the program, and without some data that I think would be helpful for us to weigh in on this process. And so, you know, respectfully, we're not sitting it out. We'll provide answers as soon as we can. If we don't know the answers, we'll say that as well. But I think it's a little premature for us to be telling you how our program is going to run when we're right now developing the regulations that will govern that program.
We're going to have to make decisions on a weekly, monthly basis from the start of this work group into the end of this work group. We can't wait until the regulations are due to make decisions about how this is going to go. You know, there are many stakeholders in this process, and all of the stakeholders are going to need to weigh in on these decisions. Staff has done an amazing job over the last few meetings of describing to the group why this is the first decision that needs to be made and how it affects ratepayers across our state based on the SOS bid process and the timeline. So there will be a decision made on these issues within the next month. We're asking that the parties give us as much information as they feel capable of by December 8th. And that will allow the other parties, the other stakeholders, to take a look at what people are suggesting and to make an informed decision. And what I'm suggesting is that Montgomery County, as one of the main parties, need not wait to start meeting internally to decide what it is that you all are going to propose on these two issues. You go ahead and start that so that you can have a response just like all of the other parties will by December the 8th.
Right. And we've been doing that, and we're just respectfully asking for some data that will help us make an informed decision. Sounds like some of that is going to be provided.
Judge Grace, I guess that was the last slide, other than the slide that we had. So that's kind of the end of our presentation there. Really appreciate the comments that folks have added, in particular it was helpful to understand a little bit more about how one could sort of manage changing the amount of SOS load, given that what we're dealing with is going to potentially only affect the last few months of a contract that sort of takes off the table, or at least sort of minimizes the impacts of doing something like having the contract change its size for the last 4 months or something of that. I think it was very helpful. I think we probably need to ask the utility folks to, one who's quite possibly, to the extent there are folks who have, there are some retail suppliers that have had experience with programs in other states that maybe aren't using the exact same approach to standard offer service that Maryland has, but maybe we can, with some understanding of how some of those things were completed and achieved in other jurisdictions where large numbers of customers were switched to a CCA, that might help us to understand, what has worked in the past, or and to the extent fits into the way our SOS model works. So I know we have had an offer from retail supplier folks to do a presentation regarding the change, some of the other programs that have been out there. I don't think we've scheduled anything for that specifically, but as we're sort of working through kind of pros and cons, I think it would be very helpful for folks to sort of kind of take what we've discussed today, propose something that looks like it might work okay for Maryland, sort of with an eye towards mitigating the impacts to the non-participants who will continue to receive SOS service. Maybe that's some of those other jurisdictional historic experience will kind of guide us a little bit further in understanding what options would probably work best here, or to the extent that we haven't picked up on an option, that introduce those to the group for next time, through those written comments that we hope folks can provide. That sort of wrap up what I think cover with the group.
I sent an email out to everyone who's on the email list today. I hope you received it. If not, please let me know. I think that's the thorough email distribution list. So if you want to use that and just hit reply all to send your comments, or to send the utility data, that's great. If you want to just send it to me, I can send it out. Folks get added every once in a while. That's great too. And I look forward to hearing from everyone as to your positions on these issues. And hopefully we'll be able to make some headway at the next meeting on December the 14th. Does anybody else have anything to add? If not, thank you for your participation today, and we'll talk to you all on December the 14th.
Everyone.